What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Haters will call it clickbait, but I actually just got finished climbing 100 SP with actual Morph in my deck. This deck is the brainchild of Lambie series. It merges a variety of powerful plans into one deck. We have Mysterio, which is helping us with Mockingbird and Sasquatch discounts. We have our generally powerful Annihilus game plan, which remains extremely strong. And of course, a wide suite of just generally good cards. This is your classic good cards mid-range list. I had a shocking amount of success with it. I believe I had about a 66% win rate, gaining 41 cubes in about 45 games, I want to say. Not really 100% sure on the math there because I'm not a math guy, but it was very successful for me in the higher end of Infinite. At this rank, I think I was pretty surprised by how good it was, to be completely honest with you. This is a deck that is very much just, I'm playing a variety of generally good stuff, and I'm just going to see how well that matches up into the metagame right now. You might think it's a little bit tough to deal with Professor X on the lane that you plan on sending an Annihilus over to, but it seems to me that this deck just has enough tools to deal with a wide variety of things, and because there are just so many good cards in it is very able to succeed in the face of a very open metagame. It's good into the stuff that you're expecting to see and also good into stuff that you're not expecting to see. Now, one major downside of this deck is when you're running a good cards list, it does tend to be pretty heavy on newer cards. So I do think that it is reasonable to look at this and say, KM, I can't afford this, you're being ridiculous. Don't worry, there are going to be other decks in here. This is just the one that I wanted to start with. Moving on to the sort of patient zero for why the metagame is the way it is, we have Husky Hela. This is, of course, the brainchild of Husky Puppies, who made the Hela deck a lot more consistent by removing Corvus Glaive from it. This enables you to have a much more controlled game plan, less of a full casino strategy, and more of a realistic, I know what's going to happen in this game strategy. The addition, of course, of Jubilee and Blink are the things that really take this deck over the top. I think before those cards were really in this deck, we did need Corvus to keep up on power, but now I'm not sure that we do. This is certainly my preferred build of Hela, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with playing a Black Knight Corvus version of this at all. In fact, I think there are a variety of people who are doing that. One card choice I would like to highlight, though, is the choice of many Hela players to play Red Hulk. Red Hulk is fine, but the major issue you're going to run into is that the easiest place to discard from in your entire deck is the card that is on the right. You are much more easily able to discard that card because that's the card that Blade targets. In order for Red Hulk to actually be meaningfully bigger than Giganto in those situations, he'll have to sit in your hand accumulating power. Meaning, if Red Hulk is that card you're blading, it's usually just going to be better to have Giganto in the deck when you blade that card. Similarly, when you're looking at a scenario where you're playing Lady Sif, it's possible they skip 2 turns and you're Lady Siffing on 3 and the Red Hulk is bigger than the Giganto, but it's also not particularly likely. In a lot of scenarios, Giganto is going to be more points than Red Hulk, especially when it's coming back off of a Hela, but also sometimes when you blink into it or Jubilee into it, it's going to be a bigger card regardless. The scenario in which Red Hulk is a better card is the scenario where you are not really drawing Hela a lot of the time. And so I think it is defensible, especially in Corvus lists, because those lists are going to be more able to make plans that involve playing a 6-drop into a 6-drop on 5 and 6 because of the Corvus, but I do think that I lean towards Giganto even in this list. That means if you're looking to cut one of these cards to put Black Knight in here, you're probably going to want to cut Red Hulk instead of Giganto. Just one man's opinion. Let's start with talking about all the stuff you're going to hate. So this is the Professor X section. If you hate Professor X or bald men or cannonballs or any of those things, you're going to want to skip ahead using the timestamps to when I'm no longer talking about Professor X. But just as I talked about Hela being the patient zero of why this metagame is the way it is, Professor X has risen up as a primary method of combating her, because without a card like this, all these sort of mid-range decks just end up dying. With Professor X, they can play an actual game of Marvel Snap against Hela. Now, I do think that, to me, the fact that maybe the cure is worse than the disease does suggest that maybe both of these cards should get nerfed. That wouldn't be what I would do if I worked at Second Dinner, is take a long, hard look at nerfing both Hela and Professor X, because this arms race does not seem healthy for anyone. So let's talk about the Professor X decks. This is the day one Sasquatch deck that I cooked up. It is very similar to another list you may already be aware of, that is simply playing cards like Havoc and Hope Summers instead of the Mysterio Sasquatch stuff. That is totally 100% acceptable. I just think that I prefer the Sasquatch version. You are very able to make those replacements if you feel the need. There is not a ton to detail about the specifics of this deck. What you're trying to do is Professor X them and then play Cannonball. That's a very powerful thing to do. Your backup plan is just a ton of stats. You have Sage, you have cheap Mockingbirds, you have cheap Sasquatches, you just have a lot of numbers that you can bring to bear. And so your plan A is this very powerful winning 2 lanes combo. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the way you win games of Marvel Snap is by winning 2 out of the 3 lanes, and Professor X says win a lane, and Cannonball says win another lane, and that's a very strong thing to do. So a lot of these decks are going to be pretty samey in that aspect and differ only in the supporting cast being put around the Professor X Cannonball combo. Just as an aside, here's what a normal version of this deck would look like without really focusing on the outrageous Sasquatch Mockingbird stuff. You can sort of see what's been changed here. I just wanted to put this on here just so you know what was modified to get to the Sasquatch list. If you want to play Loki at this point, which I think is mostly inadvisable, you have to also include Prof X Cannonball. Let's talk a little bit about Loki and his role so you understand why this is so important. Loki is an anti-mid-range card. The way Loki likes to win games is by taking your deck of presumably good cards that aren't too finicky and then playing them for cheaper. That's very good against decks that are composed of generically good cards, but it's not as good against decks like Hela or Bounce that are composed of cards that need other things to make them very good. For example, another weakness of Loki is that you can get down points earlier and Loki can't make it back up. Cards like Bishop and Angela are going to be better for you as the non-Loki player than they are going to be for them on turn 5 and 6. Those are the major weaknesses that Loki has. A generally awkward matchup into synergy-heavy combo decks, and a generally good matchup into mid-range decks. Now, this meta is fairly high, unfortunately for Loki, on these sort of combo decks. Like, it's not the worst thing in the world to play Loki into a Prof X Cannonball deck, but you could still lose that game. Similarly, if you're playing a normal Loki deck into Hela, you're just not going to actually be able to play Marvel Snap against them. Into Bounce, you're not going to be able to play Marvel Snap against them. And so you have to do this. When you do this, though, that makes you worse in Loki mirrors, because suddenly you're the deck with the good cards in it, and they're playing like Angelas and whatnot in the scalar department. And that's just a really hard thing to square for me. You end up giving up ground in Loki mirrors in order to combat the rest of the meta. This suggests to me that it's likely better to be playing a non-Loki deck right now. If this is what you have to do to play Loki, by all means, if that's what you want, you can go play Loki. But I do think that if this is what you have to do to make it work, you end up in a spot where it's possibly better to be doing anything else. Bounce, to me, has really fallen off in terms of what people are actually playing. And I don't know if it's just because it's boring or what, but I actually think this deck has a very meaningful amount of points to be able to put on the board and can really compete in a lot of different games. However, I think the major reason it's falling off is the vast preponderance of varieties of Professor X decks. Like, we showed a few of them and they tend to take that form generally, but there's even more Professor X decks than that. There's like Doc Ock Professor X decks, there's Full Tech Professor X decks, and those decks are extremely good against Bounce. Bounce is a fine, very powerful even deck, but if you are playing Professor X, you are going to be good into this, which makes this fairly poorly positioned. The issue is, if other decks show up that can beat the Professor X stuff but lose to Bounce, Bounce can actually really regain some of that position. Because, again, it's not just a deck that's good into non-Professor X stuff, it's also, like, actively good into Loki. Loki is sort of very hard-pressed to deal with what this deck is able to output. It's just not very easy for Loki to deal with that. So it is a deck that I think could be well positioned in the future, but right now I think it ends up being a little bit too punished by Professor X, by Cannonball, by this lockdown combo, and the inability to really compete with that in any meaningful way is a negative thing. Now, I've seen people replacing Bast and whatnot with Mockingbird Sasquatch, right? And here's the thing, I think you can do that, but it's the same as Loki adding Cannonball Prof X. It's like a concession to the fact that the metagame is not favorable to this right now. And I think that if you're someone who's in the position to like have Sasquatch and be able to be like, oh, I'm going to make these informed metagame decisions, you're probably going to be better off just doing that Mockingbird Sasquatch thing in the Prof X shell, like one of the decks we talked about earlier. And I think it's sort of hard for me to dodge that when people talk about how you can adjust this deck to combat Professor X. For that reason, I'm just showing the base version of this deck, just the stats. It's just stats here. There's no metagame considerations being taken, because once you start making those metagame considerations, you end up at a point where you should probably just be playing a different deck entirely. Invisible Woman, Magic, and Dr. Octopus are forming a powerful nexus of really annoying gameplay here. It is kind of impressive how, like, each time I'm like, man, this is annoying, and then I show another deck that's like, oh man, this is annoying. Dr. Octopus here is like doing his best Professor X cosplay. I have no doubt that there are builds of this deck that also play Professor X, right? This is still a Cannonball deck, but I do want to highlight this archetype because it is kind of a real thing. You will run into this. I like to call it Dock and Pray, where it's just very much a deck that is like, I'm going to play Magic on 3, I'm going to play Dock on 5, and then I'm just going to tech card every lane. I'm going to tech card every lane as heinously as possible. I've got Invisible Woman Killmonger. Your Kitty Pryde is going to go away. Like, I'm tech carding all this stuff. It's going to be great. It's going to be perfect, right? And I'm not a fan of this archetype, personally. I don't think it's amazingly good. It is just another Cannonball deck, right? Like, it's hard for that to be bad, but I do think there's likely better options in the space. But you should definitely be aware of this stuff because it is at the very least respectable. And being able to play cards of this level of impact, like Shang-Chi, like Shadow King, like Killmonger, delaying them with Invisible Woman, hiding what you're doing with Invisible Woman, this is a very scary deck to play against. It's very hard to snap into this deck. It's very easy to get bullied out of the game by this deck. It's very easy to end up in a spot where you realize, oh, I've been dead the whole time, and I didn't even realize it because I just didn't process what was going on their side of the board. Totally a thing that can will happen. Please do give this deck its due respect. Wongers is a deck I've actually had a lot of success with. You might have seen my most recent video covering this deck. You probably didn't, though, because it was like one of my worst performing videos of all time. I don't really know why, so please don't click off this video because I put it on there. Apparently, something about Wong just makes people upset. I don't know what it is. I can only assume it's Wong related. Wong is a very plausible deck here. This is a solid, fine deck. It is sort of reliant on new cards in much the same way as a lot of these decks are. And that is a thing I expect to get a lot of comments about, where people are just like, Cam, it's new cards all the time. Why are there so many new cards in here? Everything needs Nocturne. Everything needs Namora. Everything needs Red Guardian. And it's like, in a lot of these situations, those cards are replaceable. Don't get me wrong. You can do stuff with Prof X Cannonball that isn't just that. But my job, as I see it, is to show you the best versions of decks. And that, unfortunately, does involve a lot of new cards. And there's not much I can do about that, unfortunately. Like, I don't work for Second Dinner. I can't be like, hey, stop making good cards. It's messing up the budgeting for my game, right? Like, I can't really do that. But trust me, I would like to. Now, this is a powerful combo / mid-range deck. It has a fairly fragile baseline mid-range plan and a very powerful combo plan with Wong that enables it to compete with decks like Hela or Bounce on numbers. And it's also the kind of deck that is genuinely not all that bad into Loki. It's also kind of decent into Prof X if you can manage it, right? Like if you can get one thing in the Prof X lane, you can Nomura that lane to victory. That is absolutely possible. And that's really what she's adding to this, is the ability to put this extra power on the things that are getting Prof X, and of course on cards that move, so you can preemptively prevent that from happening. I made a video on this deck being back, and I think that is sort of undeniably true. I would almost call this underplayed. This list has a bit over 900 games at top 10% infinite. It's got like a 57% win rate, like a very positive cube rate. This is a legitimately good deck, and I think that in the event that Professor X gets nerfed and Hela does not, this is going to be the kind of thing that I'm going to start with. It is legitimately powerful. Now, keep in mind just how much of what we talked about in terms of the cards that are being played were very powerful on reveals on turn 6, specifically Cannonball, but also, you know, Sage, Hitmonkey, Hela, right? Leech is unbelievably good right now. Just a great card into all of that stuff. And yes, it is not as good as it was when we were turning Leech into Red Hulk, but it turns out turning Jubilee into Leech is still quite powerful because of the fact that Leech is so much better than it was previously. Like, not in an absolute sense, but decks are built ignoring this now. When this was the dominant strategy in the metagame, nobody was playing the stuff that it beat. It's kind of gone now. Everyone is playing the stuff that it beats. Cerebro 3 remains an actual deck against all odds. A powerful amount of tech is able to be put in this deck. A really shocking amount of tech, to be honest with you. There is a lot of problem-solving ability in this archetype. Now, the one major flex slot you have is that Shang-Chi spot. You have the option of running Iron Man or Valkyrie or cutting something else and running both. Like, there's a lot you can do here. I do think it's probably better to run Red Guardian over Mobius, but if you don't have Red Guardian, Mobius obviously a very perfectly acceptable substitute. This is a straightforward and powerful deck that really actually, to my mind, does rely on the interactive tools that it has in order to do what it needs to do in this metagame, but those interactive tools are better than they ever have before. Better than they ever have been before, I should say. Cards like US Agent and Shang-Chi and Killmonger and Red Guardian, like, this is a very good meta for a lot of that stuff. And the fact that you are a deck that is so incredibly hard to play Professor X against is something that really sticks out about this archetype, because you are so able to back buff your lanes that between Cerebro and Mystique, you are very often extremely difficult to land a profitable Professor X against. You also have US Agent. You also have Jeff. There's just a lot going for you in a matchup against Prof X, and I think that's really what's keeping this deck afloat right now. This is Yo Woody's build of Silver Surfer. It is optimized to go as tall as you possibly can within the confines of the archetype. This is, again, in order to have a reasonable to plausible matchup into things like Hela, but also because points are good and winning games with a lot of points is pretty good. Now, this deck does have some actually interesting advantages, but I do think one thing I specifically want to highlight is just how important Hope Summers is in a deck like this. Hope Summers is what enables all of your most broken things to happen. She is the alpha and the omega. She is as good as it gets in a deck like this because of just how she enables you to go into playing 2/3 drops on turn 5, maybe a 2, a 3, and a 3 on turn 6 if possible. Like, there's just a lot that she lets you do, but specifically that 2 3s on 5 thing is very strong. You also do have this massive ability to get out very far ahead against Professor X type decks because of Brood, because of Absorbing Man. You are able to put yourself in situations where it's very difficult to Professor X against you as well, because you're ahead, but also because of the power of Silver Surfer, adding more points to those lanes afterwards. I think DeathBird is a fairly okay archetype, but really what this is doing is just trying to put as many points on the board as it possibly can, and doing everything it can to play every single big guy that gets discounted. That's the name of the game here. We have Scar, we have Death, we have Mockingbird, we have Sasquatch. We're really very dedicated to this let's play a medium point slam game type thing. And it's not the worst thing in the world. Like, you are outputting a lot of points. You're just not really doing anything about what your opponent is doing. You have one tech slot. It's on Shadow King here. It could be Lady Deathstrike if you want. Like, there's really not a lot of room for this deck to modify itself to fit what a metagame is. It's just, here's some big dumb power. I hope you enjoyed playing against my big dumb power. This deck has been making the rounds. I believe it was made by somebody on Reddit and then popularized by Regis Kilbin. And to be clear, of all the decks on this tier list, this is probably the worst. It has the lowest win rate on Untapped. I have, in my estimation, the least sort of, I would say, fear of this deck that I do of any of the other ones. However, a lot of that is because I know what's going on, right? So what this deck is trying to do is Ultron Killmonger, play a giant null, maybe play a Galactus, all of that kind of stuff, right? The fundamental thing that's going on here is that first interaction, but it's also just like a normal ramp deck. You have your Electro draws, you can do normal Electro Galactus things, you can play actual Marvel Snap like that. And I think once you understand what this deck is doing, what it's trying to do, get that cheap death, things of that nature, once you figure that out, it becomes a lot easier to beat. But there are like a bunch of tricky things in here, right? Like, what happens when your opponent blinks something into a Galactus? That wave turns into a Galactus and you're just like, oh, okay, guess I've gotten Galactus, right? There is a lot going on here, and I do think it's important for you to be familiar with it. This is a deck that gets a lot of its percentage points off of people not really knowing what the hell is going on. So please do pay attention to what this deck is. Understand the varieties of things they're going to try to do to you, whether that ranges from, you know, typical Galactus, Nulls type stuff, which you can beat with a cannonball on that lane, or, God forbid, Ultron into, like, Death Null, or, like, Death Destroyer, or Destroyer Death. There's just a bunch of stuff. There's just a bunch of stuff this deck can do, and once you're aware of the cards in it, it becomes a lot less threatening. But until you are, this is actually just very scary. It'll scam you cubes. Destroy remains a deck, and as always, the real thing to talk about with Destroy is what are you doing with your one tech slot? In this case, I got this list from Shuri Enjoyer, atypically not playing Shuri, and he's playing the Goliath here. Now, you might be like, Cam, why do you hate fun so much? To this I respond, it's not, you know, Goliath's fault. This card is here to stop you from getting cannonballed. That's what's going on here. This is the point in the metagame that we've reached. We have reached the point in the metagame where we're running Goliath to beat Cannonball. That's where we are. I don't like it either. Spectrum Ongoing remains an intriguing deck, actually. There are a few things that are going against it right now, but the general power level of this deck when the Jean Grey hits is actually quite high against a variety of things that are reliant on needing to be able to play certain cards in certain places and have them actually happen and not get Cosmo'd and all of that good stuff, right? Now, I do think that this is one of the weaker decks on the whole, but the archetype remains a functional, good deck, and I'm happy to be able to say that. Like, I don't think you're going to be outclassed dramatically by playing this deck. I just don't think it's necessarily one of the best options that you have available to you. It is quite interesting into a sea of Prof X Cannonball to be a Jean Grey deck, for sure. If you're someone who enjoyed playing Sarah Control, I think the best way to think of Thor Control as just sort of the upgraded version of Sarah Control. It does all the stuff that Sarah would typically try to do, except it does it while also playing like a 5/9 and a 4/12 and a 3/10, and that gives it some real power. This deck is also better positioned than Sarah Control due to the fact that you have these Thors into decks like Professor X decks, because you have not only the Thors, but also cards like Jeff, cards like Miss Marvel that can really, really ruin what those decks are going for. Being able to backdoor win a Professor X lane will very often win you the game against those decks, One thing to keep in mind, though, a lot of Professor X decks are running Red Guardian. You are going to want to consider that instead of just like playing a naked Miss Marvel out there where it can be Red Guardian. Do consider avoiding that situation if you are counting on Miss Marvel's points. This deck is very fair. Now, I will say that Yo Woody has a build of this that I think might be a little more promising, but I cannot confirm for sure, so please do check him out on Twitch if you want to see that version of this. I tend to think that the vast majority of the Scar Namora decks just end up falling into this situation where I don't really feel like what they're doing is strong enough for me to be confident in them. And that actually includes one of the major omissions here, which is the Blink Knight deck. You're not going to find that here. I've played that deck. I did not enjoy it. I do not think it is a real deck. Or I guess it's a real deck. You could play it. But of all the decks on here, that is the one that I had by far the worst experience with. And I think a lot of that is just these are sort of not necessarily half-baked. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just very fair. Like, you're doing things that are fundamentally not all that broken. You're doing like, okay, I'll get some unfair stuff some of the time, but just doesn't really strike me as doing things that are unfair enough to succeed in this metagame. It's close, but I tend to think that both this and the Blink Knight decks are occupying a space that is perhaps better occupied by the Wong deck right now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it to the end of that XL video. Please do keep one thing in mind. This is my personal tier list. If my opinion is valuable to you and helps you, I'm very grateful for that. But what I don't like is people who see this tier list and think these are the only things I can play. Obviously, I can't make any substitutions. This game is pay to win, da-da-da-da-da. I think there actually is a conversation to be had about the game being pay to win. There's a lot of really good cards coming out recently. But I also think that if you want to make substitutions to a lot of these decks, you should be able to. I hope that I made clear what I'm talking about with that. There are some decks where you like have to have those cards, and there are some decks where you don't have to have those cards. I hope, and this is something I really, really want to convey. I try very hard when I do these videos to convey to you the context in which I make the decisions about each deck, right? I have played with and against all of these decks. These are decks that I have experience with, but there's only so much time in the day. And so what that means is it is entirely possible that there are decks that I haven't played. There are decks that I haven't gotten to. I do my best on these. I really do. But I need you to understand that I am not the be-all, end-all. I do not define the metagame. My lists are here so that you can succeed with them. I don't like feeling like I'm a contributor to people feeling bad about the game, where they see these lists and they're like, unattainable. I don't have Goliath, so I can't play that destroy list. You can. We're talking about adjustments of like fairly marginal ranges here. The thing is, when you're trying really hard, those marginal ranges do matter. But if you're talking about climbing to infinite, you can probably do that with anything. I really want you to know that. Like, it is something that I truly believe any human being putting in the time and effort to improve can accomplish. And I don't want you... Basically, I feel like these videos have become something that makes people feel like a gate is closed on them rather than a gate that is opened to them. And I guess I just wanted to speak about that a little bit because I don't like contributing to that. I'm still going to be giving you the best decks. That's what I do, right? But I don't want you to feel like because KM said it, that's the only build I can play. I'm missing one card, so I can't play this. I don't want you to feel that way. There are situations where that's true. If you're missing Cannonball, you probably can't play a Cannonball Prof X deck. But there are a lot of situations where it's not. And I hope that my discussion of the context of these decks gives you the answers to questions like, what can I replace? I'm hoping you can understand that from how I talk about them. As always, thank you so much for making it through this video. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Enjoy the KM Boost, and I'll see you in the next one.